IB Biodiversity, Evolution, and Classification Part 2 will focus on the primary mechanism of evolution, known as natural selection. The essential idea is the diversity of life has evolved and continues to evolve by natural selection. It's important to note that natural selection is not the only mechanism that drives evolution. Random events also play a role, something about which I will speak later in the unit. Here is the outline of movies available for you. As a part of this unit, use this outline to choose the movie you need to study. This movie has its focus right here. Darwin was the first to accurately describe the process of natural selection, but Darwin was not the first person to propose that evolution had occurred. Lamarck had proposed the occurrence of evolution, but his mechanism, the mechanism of acquired characteristics, was just not right. More on Lamarck later in this movie. Evolution can be defined as the process by which modern organisms have descended from ancestral organisms, or defined as when heritable characteristics of a species change over time, descent with modification, or defined as continuous genetic adaptation of populations through mutation, selection, and drift, or defined as a change in allele frequency over time in a population. Fossils, such as this huge leg of a dinosaur, were known to people during Darwin's time, and specimens, such as this one, were clear indications of change on Earth over time. If the Earth species were unchanging, immutable, placed there on Earth by God, what about organisms that were known from the fossil record, but were no longer present? Darwin was aware of organisms that were extinct, and this alone suggested that there had been change among the Earth's organisms over time. Darwin was also aware that different species shared common characteristics. Here we can see a chimpanzee on the left and a human on the right, and the facial features are very similar. Both species have hair, along with forward-facing eyes, fingers, and fingernails. These shared characteristics suggest common ancestry. Artificial selection, also known as selective breeding, can be seen here as the plant in the center, a wild mustard, is the common ancestor of the cabbage and the cauliflower, the broccoli, kohlrabi, kale, and Brussels sprouts. Farmers, having chosen for certain characteristics among varied individuals in a population, brought about the varieties we see here in this image. Selection for leaf resulted in cabbage, selection for flower bud resulted in cauliflower and broccoli, and selection for lateral buds along the stem resulted in Brussels sprouts. Darwin was aware that farmers had done some selecting, changing populations over time, and this wild mustard was the common ancestor of them all. Darwin grew up on a farm, and having grown up on a farm, he knew that farmers had changed the characteristics of their plants and animal populations over time by selecting those individuals that produced what the farmer most desired, say wool in the case of sheep, or milk in the case of a cow, or number of eggs or size of eggs in the case of chickens. He was internally aware, that there had been a selection process at the hands of farmers, not in nature, but as a result there was a change in the characteristics, the genetic characteristics of populations over time. So coming up is how evolution by natural selection works. But first, let me define some terms. A population is a group of individuals of the same species. Species is a population whose members have the potential to interbreed in nature to produce viable, fertile offspring. Species, a group of actually or potentially interbreeding populations with a common gene pool that produce fertile offspring. Here's an important IB syllabus statement. Describe the important elements of the mechanism of natural selection. These elements are also known as the principles of natural selection. I'd like you to think of writing 5 to 6 statements. Darwin's ideas about natural selection started with variation. Individuals within a species vary from one another. They're all slightly different. For example, in this slide, we can see that these ladybugs are different from one another, and we would assume that the patterning is controlled by the specific alleles of genes in the population. All sexually reproducing populations display this variation, and it is the variation that is the raw material on which selection acts. Variation comes from mutation, from meiosis, 2 events in meiosis, independent assortment, and crossing over. As well, variation comes from the random recombination of genes through fertilization, also known as random mating. In sexually reproducing populations, individuals display variety, genetic inherited variety. You now know that the variety comes from mutations, meiosis, and random mating. Meiosis produces variation through independent assortment and crossing over. In this slide, you can see the variation in a population of people. You know the source of variation in populations. 2 IB syllabus statements to keep in mind. Natural selection can only occur if there is variation among members of the same species. State that populations tend to produce more offspring than the environment can support. With variation as the first principle of natural selection, the second principle, is that populations reproduce well. Populations reproduce in high numbers. In this slide, we see a fungus releasing huge numbers of spores, reproductive structures to the wind by the millions. We see prolific reproduction in all populations. Fruit flies, as you can see here, reproducing by the thousands, by the millions. Even with elephants, reproduction is plentiful. Darwin calculated the reproductive rate of elephants using some basic facts: that elephants live for about 90 years, that elephants become reproductively mature at about the age of 30, and that a pair of elephants produce about 6 offspring in their lifetimes. Darwin used these facts to calculate that over 40 generations, 1,200 years, 7 billion elephants would have been produced, but he knew that elephants hadn't taken over. So that brings us to the third principle involving competition for limited resources. In any population, competition exists among the individuals in the population. In this slide, we can see 2 African wild dogs competing over food, and one of the 2 seems to have snagged the food from the other. The one without the food may go hungry, as the one with the food feeds the family. Some individuals will get the resource, while others do less well. Those who gain access to the resource are likely to survive and reproduce at higher rates than their neighbor. Now keep your eye on the ball here. We've got a varied population, high numbers of offspring, and competition for resources. We can see competition for resources in this slide. There's a population of lions competing for prey, the zebra. Some lions will take down a zebra and some won't. Those that do catch prey will reproduce at higher rates than those who don't. In turn, there's a population of zebra competing with each other to feed well and escape the predators, the lions. Those that escape the lion will reproduce at rates higher than those who don't. So, in populations, there are excess numbers of individuals, more than can be supported by the resources, resulting in competition, such that only a fraction of all offspring in each generation survive to reproduce. The elephants didn't take over. So, natural selection increases the frequency of characteristics that make individuals better adapted and decrease the frequency of other characteristics, leading to changes within the species. The last principle in Darwin's 4-step process of natural selection is this: individuals best suited to the environment, those that have traits that give them advantage in competition with others in the population, survive and reproduce at rates higher than others in the population. In this slide, we can see a population of beetles with variation, many beetles with variation. The environment is represented by the dark background and the bird as a predator. Those with slightly darker coloration survive and reproduce at higher rates than those with lighter coloration. The darker beetles are better suited to the environment. Selection is a difference in the survival and reproduction of individuals based on inherited traits. Over time, the population changes. The collective set of genes, known as the gene pool, changes. With the bird as a predator in an environment with a dark background, individuals with darker coloration increase. There is a genetic shift in the population toward a higher frequency of beetles with the dark carapace. Evolution can be defined as a change in the frequency of alleles in a population over time. Now, you should be able to comfortably handle these two IB syllabus statements, and if that's not the case, go back and review the previous 13 slides. Explain how natural selection increases the frequency of characteristics that make individuals better adapted and decreases the frequency of other characteristics, leading to changes within the species. State that evolution of a species occurs when natural selection selects the most fit among varied forms. Here is a summary of natural selection. These statements should feel comfortable to you. Heritable variation exists in the population. Populations produce more offspring than the environment can support. There's competition among individuals within a population, a struggle for existence, often with limited resources. Individuals with the best traits for gaining the resources survive and reproduce at rates higher than individuals with traits less well adapted. Each generation contains more offspring of better adapted individuals relative to less well adapted individuals. Individuals that reproduce pass on their characteristics to their offspring. The frequency of characteristics that make individuals better adapted increase. Here's a boiled down version of what I've presented on natural selection. I'll let you study this slide on your own. Here is a cartoon that incorrectly interprets evolution, and I'm asking you to identify the problem with the interpretation of evolution as presented by the cartoon. Notice this fish has legs and this one doesn't, and we could take that to mean the natural range of genetic variation in the fish population, and that isn't necessarily what's wrong with the cartoon. But this fish with the legs says that he's going to crawl up on the beach and evolve, and that is what's wrong with the cartoon. Individuals cannot evolve, only populations evolve. A population of fish would need to change their location and allow the environment to select some to survive and reproduce at higher rates than others in order for the population to evolve. Darwin was not the first to propose that organisms had changed over time. He wasn't the first to propose evolution. Lamarck, in 1809, had done just that. And Lamarck proposed a theory about change based on the selective use or disuse of organs that were acquired over one's lifetime, called acquired characteristics. And this is how his theory went. A short-necked giraffe, such as this one, would stretch for leaves, stretching the neck reaching for leaves, and by virtue of stretching, would have a longer neck and then give rise to young giraffes with long necks. So the idea is that if you use an arm repeatedly over and over again, and the arm gets stronger and stronger, weights are being lifted and you're getting stronger, that you will give birth to children who also have very strong arms. Now, Lamarck's theory was easily refuted. For example, if I weight lift regularly over years and develop my arms, I will not give birth to children with strong arms. Or conversely, if I lose an arm in an accident, I'm not going to be the father of children without arms. So, Lamarck was wrong, but brave in presenting his theory. He proposed evolution was occurring. It's just that he had the wrong mechanism. Now we move our understanding of evolution in a slightly new direction, and here are two IB syllabus statements. State that members of a species may be reproductively isolated in separate populations. Populations of a species can gradually diverge into separate species by evolution, especially if they're reproductively isolated. If you understand how selection happens in any environment, the formation of new species, known as speciation, becomes relatively straightforward. If two populations become geographically isolated, as you can see with these two populations of squirrels separated by the width and depth of the Grand Canyon, they can no longer exchange genes. They can no longer exchange alleles. Thus, any change due to mutation or selection in either location results in the accumulation of unique genetic change. Genetic change that's not shared with the other population. In time, the populations become different species, as they have here. Here again, we can see speciation as a result of geographic isolation. On the left, we have one species in a single common habitat, and all the individuals are freely able to exchange DNA. Then, over time, a river cuts through the land to separate two populations. The two populations are no longer able to exchange DNA. This is reproductive isolation. Change in the DNA due to mutation and selection is not shared. This is reproductive isolation. Thus, the populations diverge to become different species. Geographic isolation resulting in speciation is known as allopatric speciation. This is the most common mechanism of speciation. Once again, in this diagram, starting here, you can see that environmental change results in a separation of two populations, causing reproductive isolation. Once reproductive isolation occurs, the two populations no longer share mutation or genetic change that comes from selection. The two populations diverge, becoming different species. So that brings us to two important IB syllabus statements. Explain how adaptive radiation produces similarities in structure, homologous structure, when there are differences in function. Populations of a species can gradually diverge into separate species by evolution. Adaptive radiation is a form of allopatric speciation where an ancestral population colonizes an unoccupied niche, as can be seen here, as population A reaches this island, resulting in reproductive isolation. Time passes, mutation occurs, selection occurs, but genetic changes are not shared between the populations. Thus, ultimately, speciation occurs, forming species B. A subgroup of population B migrates to another island, vacant niches become occupied, and reproductive isolation occurs. Time passes, mutation occurs, selection occurs, but genetic changes are not shared. Speciation forms species C. Repeat. The fruit fly of Hawaii underwent adaptive radiation as it migrated from older ancestral islands to unoccupied niches on newer islands. As fly populations moved to new islands and the unoccupied niches that were there, reproductive isolation occurred, resulting in speciation, allopatric speciation. In California, an ancestral population of salamander gave rise to different populations on either side of the Sierra Nevada mountains. With reproductive isolation, salamanders on the east side of the mountains are a different species from the west side. Interestingly, the two different species encounter each other at the southern edge of the mountains, but they can't produce fertile offspring. They're different species. The Larus gull provides an interesting example of speciation. Circling the Arctic, gull population 1 can mate with gull population 2, and gull population 2 can mate with 3, and 3 with 4, etc. Gull population 6 can mate with population 7, but gull population 7 cannot mate with gull population 1. Does that make 7 and 1 separate species, even though genes can be exchanged throughout the Arctic region? The pattern seen here is called ring species. Once lizards reached the Galapagos Islands, 600 kilometers from the coast of Ecuador, they radiated to different islands, filling available niches in each different location. Once reproductively isolated, allopatric speciation occurred, as can be seen here. Continuous variation across the geographical range of related populations matches the concept of gradual divergence through adaptive radiation. With all of the examples I've provided over the last 10 slides, you can now understand the essence of this IB syllabus statement. Continuous variation across the geographical range of related populations matches the concept of gradual divergence. Darwin found variation in the sizes of beaks across a geographical range of the Galapagos Islands. The variation in beak size, evidence of speciation, resulted from gradual divergence from an ancestral species. Evolution can occur over relatively short periods of time when the environment changes. For example, the beak size of Galapagos finches on the island Daphne Major were measured by Grant and Grant from the early 1970s to the early 1990s. During dry periods, La Nina periods, such as 1975 to 1980, there was an abundance of large, hard seeds with very few small, soft seeds. Over these 5 years, Average beak size increased in the population as those with larger beaks were better able to access food. During wet periods, El Niño periods, such as the early 1980s, small soft seeds became more abundant. Selection favored smaller beaks, and average beak size decreased. Homologous structures are evidence of adaptive radiation over long periods of time, having evolved from a common ancestor. All of the organisms in this diagram have structures that are adapted to different functions. From the common ancestor, the species seen in this diagram radiated to occupy different niches. So that brings us to this IB syllabus statement. Explain two examples of evolution in response to environmental change, for example, multiple antibiotic resistance in bacteria. In this image, you can see a population of bacteria that display genetic variation by way of mutation. Drugs, antibiotics, are added to their environment and become the selection agent within the environment. Some bacteria die. In fact, maybe most die, but because of the variation that exists, not all die. Those best suited to survive in the new environment that includes the antibiotics, they reproduce at higher rates than others. Antibiotic-resistant bacteria increase in number. The allele conferring drug resistance increases in frequency in the population. Here's a diagram describing bacterial evolution in response to environmental change. Spend some time with this slide to fully grasp the concern of the medical community regarding the overuse of antibiotics. Many people die each year because they become infected with bacteria that are resistant to antibiotics. From the perspective of bacteria, antibiotic drugs represent a change in the environment. Due to the natural variation in the bacterial population, antibiotics kill most, but not all, of the bacteria. Over time, the alleles for antibiotic resistance increase as the individuals with some form of resistance survive and reproduce at rates higher than others. Once again, here is the original population displaying genetic variation. The environment changes, the antibiotic drug arrives. Some individuals are more resistant to the antibiotic than others. Those most suited to survive will reproduce in the presence of the drug, and their numbers increase, their numbers multiply. In other words, the gene conferring resistance increases in frequency over time within the population. In this diagram, a population of insects displays genetic variation. An insecticide is sprayed into the environment. This is a change in the environment. Some insects are more resistant to the insecticide than others. They survive and then reproduce at rates higher than others. The frequency of the gene conferring resistance increases over time. Here's an IB syllabus statement that should be self-evident. State that adaptations are characteristics that make an individual suited to its environment and way of life. Antibiotic resistance, or the camouflage apparent in the animals seen in these photos, are adaptations that make an individual suited to its environment and way of life. And that brings us to the end of IB Bio Diversity, Evolution, and Classification, Part 2.